The lawyer across the table read 3 documents and went silent. My wife's attorney called mine privately the next morning with a single question: doesn't he know who he is? Not because I had fought back. Not because I had threatened anyone. But because I had signed the divorce papers without hesitation, walked away without a word, and left behind a settlement so precisely structured that she had unknowingly negotiated herself out of $22 million. I didn't destroy them. I simply let them take exactly what I had prepared for them to find. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Party Monk. I am 41 years old, and I run the most quietly powerful real estate investment firm in Chicago, Illinois. I say quietly because that was always my preference, building in silence, letting the results do the talking, letting the skyline speak on my behalf while I stayed invisible behind the numbers. By the time most people in my industry learned my name, I had already acquired 17 commercial properties across 4 states, and I was already 3 moves ahead of anyone trying to figure out how I'd done it. I did not come from money. I came from a 2-bedroom apartment in Gary, Indiana, where my mother worked double hospital shifts and my father left on a Tuesday morning when I was 9 years old and never once looked back. I remember standing at the window watching his car disappear around the corner, and I remember deciding, in the way only a 9-year-old with nowhere to put his pain can decide, that I would never need anyone to stay. I would build something so solid that leaving would be the other person's loss, not mine. I carried that decision into every boardroom, every negotiation, every relationship I ever entered. I married Maddie Party 11 years ago in a small Nashville, Tennessee ceremony when I owned nothing but a vision and a second-hand suit. She stood across from me and said she believed in what I was building. I believed her completely. I gave her everything, not just the comfort that came later, but the vulnerable, unguarded version of me that existed before the money arrived and changed the temperature of every room I walked into. I have one brother. 4 years younger, magnetic, charming in the way that costs other people everything. What he did is the reason you're here. But what matters right now, what nobody around me understood yet, is that 6 months before the storm arrived, I had already quietly restructured every asset I owned. The foundation was already moved. I was already standing on dry ground. I came home early that Tuesday in March because a property closing in downtown Chicago wrapped 3 hours ahead of schedule, and I was in the kind of mood that makes a man stop for flowers. The kind of mood where you think about booking a weekend away, where you feel like patience is finally paying its dividends in the small, warm currency of ordinary life. I stopped at a florist on Michigan Avenue and bought tulips. Maddie's favorite. I held them on the passenger seat the entire drive to Naperville like they were something I needed to protect. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong before I could name why. Her car sat in the driveway exactly where it should be. His truck was parked 2 houses down, a detail my brain registered and immediately filed without alerting my heart. I had seen that truck in that spot before. I realize that now. The mind protects you until it decides you are ready. I walked through the front door and set the tulips on the marble kitchen counter. The silence had weight to it. Texture. Then I heard her laugh from upstairs, that specific, private, unguarded laugh she hadn't directed at me in longer than I wanted to calculate. I stood at the bottom of the staircase with my hand on the railing and my heart beat surprisingly, almost disturbingly, slow. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't arrive as pain. It arrives as clarity. 8 months of half-noticed signals assembled themselves in my chest all at once, the turned-away phone screens, the unexplained receipts, the way she sometimes looked slightly past me at family dinners as though measuring the distance to somewhere else. Every fragment locked into place in under 10 seconds. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the tulips. I carried them back to my car and drove away without making a sound. No confrontation. No dramatics. Just a man who had already learned, at 9 years old, standing at a rain-streaked window in Gary, Indiana, how to watch something leave and begin planning immediately for what comes next. Let me tell you who my brother was before he became who he became, because the betrayal only fully lands when you understand the investment behind it. When I was 23 years old and pulling 60-hour weeks at a property management company in Indianapolis, I was sending $300 home every month to keep my mother's lights on and my brother in school. He was 19, brilliant in the scattered, untrained way that raw talent often presents, funny, magnetic, the kind of person who walked into rooms and rearranged the energy simply by existing inside them. I believed in him the way I believed in undervalued properties. I saw what he could become if someone just gave him the right structure. I paid for 2 years of college before he dropped out. I didn't cut him off. Instead, I brought him into my firm, gave him a junior acquisitions role, and spent 3 years teaching him how to read a deal, how to speak to investors, how to carry himself in rooms that don't naturally make space for men who grew up like us. I built him deliberately, the same way I built everything, brick by brick, with patience and without shortcuts. 3 years before any of this collapsed, he came to me drowning. A failed Atlanta business venture had left him owing nearly $200,000 to private lenders. He sat across from my kitchen table in Naperville on a Sunday evening, and for the first time since childhood, I watched my brother cry. I paid every dollar without hesitation. I asked for nothing except loyalty. He shook my hand, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "I will never forget what you did for me." I believed him completely. What I didn't understand then is that debt has a psychology. Some people, when rescued from ruin, feel gratitude. Others feel diminished, quietly resentful of the rescue, unable to look at their savior without seeing their own failure reflected back. I know now which type my brother was. I simply learned it too late, at the bottom of a staircase, listening to my wife laugh. Adrienne Voss had been my attorney for 9 years, and she knew the architecture of my business better than most of my own employees. When I called her the morning after I left those tulips on the counter and checked into a hotel in Oak Park, I used exactly 4 words: start the divorce proceedings. There was a pause on the line, the kind that holds an unasked question, and then she said, "Come in tomorrow morning," and I said, "I'll be there at 9. Her office sat on the 32nd floor of a building in the Loop, dark wood panels, low warm lighting, a city view that on any other day I would have appreciated. She had 2 folders on the table when I arrived. One thin. One very thick. She slid the thin one toward me first: standard divorce filing paperwork, equitable distribution language, the procedural skeleton of a marriage ending on paper. I looked at it without touching it. Then she placed her hand on the thick folder and said she needed me to see something before I signed anything. Inside was everything her team and my private investigator had assembled over 4 months, because I had retained that investigator back in November, before the evidence had become undeniable, back when I was still hoping I was wrong. Phone records. Timestamps. Financial transfers from the joint account I rarely monitored. Hotel receipts from Milwaukee. From Indianapolis. From a boutique hotel in New Orleans during a weekend when my brother claimed to be at a property conference and Maddie claimed to be visiting her college roommate. The same weekend. The same city. The same room. I read every page without speaking. When I finished, I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Adrienne watched me the way you watch someone standing too close to a ledge. I looked at her and said, "I know everything in that folder. I want to sign." She picked up her pen slowly and then stopped. She asked if I understood what I was walking away from on paper. I told her I understood exactly. While Adrienne and I sat across from each other in that Loop office, my investigator was flagging something new, something that transformed this story from a personal wound into a calculated operation. In the 60 days prior, my brother had submitted loan applications for 2 residential properties in the Chicago suburbs. Inside those applications, he had made informal references to the family business, implying access to resources he did not independently possess. One application, reviewed by a mortgage broker in Evanston, cited a projected inheritance. He had used the word inheritance as though my assets were already in motion toward him. They had run the numbers. Both of them, together, had looked at 11 years of marriage and calculated that a divorce filing would detonate my holdings, that Maddie's legal claim as a long-term spouse would fracture my financial foundation and send significant assets into a split that would ultimately flow in their direction. It wasn't just an affair. It was a coordinated exit strategy with my net worth as the destination. Maddie's younger sister, who I had always suspected was closer to my brother than anyone acknowledged, had apparently been the architect of this particular calculation. She had sat in someone's kitchen and mapped out how the leverage worked. The marriage had been reframed, somewhere along the way, not as a life but as a position. A financial position that could be liquidated. What made this devastating in a way that went beyond anger was that Maddie hadn't always been this person. In the early Nashville years, in the lean Chicago winters before the firm found its footing, she had been genuinely beside me. I believe that. What changed her, I think, was the magnitude of the wealth itself, that specific altitude where some people stop seeing their partner and start seeing their proximity to power. My brother, always knowing exactly which door was unlocked, had walked straight through it. In the surveillance photograph my investigator sent that afternoon, my brother was leaning back in a mortgage broker's chair, relaxed and laughing. He was wearing the Cartier watch I had given him for his 35th birthday. Engraved on the back with a single word, brother. I signed the divorce papers in 11 minutes. Every page, every initial, every signature line, steady hand, no hesitation, no performance of reluctance. Adrian watched each page turn with the focused stillness of someone who has learned, over decades of difficult rooms, when to speak and when to simply bear witness. When I finished, I stacked the pages evenly and slid them back across the table like I was closing a deal I'd already priced correctly. She told me that Maddie's attorneys would trigger a full financial discovery process within 30 days of receiving the filing. They would request complete disclosure of every asset, every holding, every account connected to my name. She said it carefully, the way you deliver information to someone you respect and are also slightly afraid of getting wrong. I told her what they would find. A legally structured asset reorganization completed 6 months prior to the filing. Every transfer documented, timestamped, and reviewed by my tax attorney, my corporate attorney, and an independent forensic accountant. Every holding repositioned into a Delaware private holding company with clean, unimpeachable paperwork. There was nothing to unwind because nothing had been hidden, it had simply been moved, legally, months before any of this became a legal matter. Adrian sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long, quiet moment. The city behind the window had shifted from morning gold to flat afternoon gray. She said, slowly, "You planned this." Not a question. A recognition. I told her I had come home with tulips. I told her I was a patient man. What I didn't say, what I had not told anyone, was that the restructuring had originally been intended as something else entirely. 18 months ago, I had drafted partnership documents to bring my brother into 2 new acquisitions as a minority stakeholder. A gesture of inclusion after everything I had invested in him. Then the accountant flagged the joint account transfers. I paused. I watched. And I signed restructuring documents instead of partnership documents. The entire shape of my future turned on 30 days of hesitation and one accountant's phone call. I walked into the Michigan Avenue conference room alone, carrying nothing except composure. No associates, no entourage, just me and Adrian, who carried everything necessary in a single briefcase with the quiet confidence of someone who has already won the argument before it begins. The room was glass-walled and bright, a deliberate choice by their side, I assumed, the kind of environment designed to make the opposing party feel exposed. I sat down without looking at either of them directly and poured myself a glass of water from the carafe at the center of the table like I had all the time in the world. Maddie sat flanked by 2 attorneys. My brother sat beside her. The geometric honesty of that arrangement, the 2 of them on the same side of the table, was the first moment any of this felt completely, visually real. She looked composed but tight around the eyes. He looked confident in the specific way of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. Their lead attorney placed a demand letter on the table. Claims totaling approximately $4 million across shared investments, property equity, and business interests. I read it completely. I set it down. Adrian opened her briefcase and placed 3 documents on the table. The Delaware restructuring filings dated 6 months prior. A certified compliance letter from my tax attorney. An independent asset valuation of everything remaining in marital territory, a number considerably more modest than the demand letter had assumed. I watched the lead attorney read. I watched the confidence in the room quietly rearrange itself, the way air pressure changes before weather. I looked at my brother for the first time since walking in. He was reading over the attorney's shoulder, and moving across his face was the particular expression of a man recalculating a bet he believed was already paid. I then looked at Maddie. She was already looking at me, not with defiance, not with guilt, but with something closer to the slow recognition of a fundamental miscalculation. I held her gaze without anger, without performance. Just the steadiness of a man who had already grieved while everyone else was still arriving at the scene. He caught up to me in the hallway near the elevator bank during the recess, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, we were completely alone. The hallway was fluorescent and gray and utterly without drama, which felt appropriate. The truth rarely arrives in cinematic lighting. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Not physically, but in the way that people shrink when the version of themselves they've been performing finally runs out of stage. He said he was sorry. I'll give him that. He said it the way people say it when they mean it and simultaneously know it isn't enough, that particular apology that functions as both genuine remorse and an appeal for reduced consequences. He said Maddie had come to him first. He said it started during the months I was traveling constantly for the Baltimore portfolio, 4 days a week, 6 months straight. He said he'd hated himself every single day since. He said he knew none of it made it right. I let him finish without interrupting. I didn't perform forgiveness and I didn't perform rage because I had done both of those things privately, alone in a hotel room in Oak Park, weeks before this hallway. What came out of me was something quieter and more permanent. I told him I understood how it started. I told him I could even, in the most painful and honest part of myself, understand the feeling. What I could not move past was not the affair but the financial scheming, the loan applications, the inheritance language, the coordinated calculation. That was not a man following his feelings. That was a man drawing a target on his brother's life's work. He looked at the floor. I reached into my jacket pocket and held out the Cartier watch. I had collected it from the investigator's evidence file 3 days earlier. He stared at it. I placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. I told him to have his attorney call Adrian by Friday regarding the loan applications. Then the elevator opened and I stepped inside and the doors closed between us, and that was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 days after the conference room, Maddie's legal team withdrew the additional claims and accepted the disclosed asset valuation. The divorce moved toward final agreement faster than they had planned and far quieter than I had feared, which told me everything about what they had expected versus what they had found. They had expected a war. They had expected me to fight from a defensive position, scrambling to protect things I hadn't protected in time. The speed of their retreat confirmed that the restructuring had worked precisely as designed. Adrian called me into her office on a Thursday evening to walk through the final execution documents. The city outside her window was fully dark by the time we finished, the Chicago skyline doing what it always does, indifferent, brilliant, continuous. She closed the last folder and looked at me across the desk with an expression I had never seen on her face in 9 years of working together. Something between professional admiration and something rawer, more personal. She told me that Maddie's lead attorney had called her privately that morning. He had spent the weekend conducting his own independent research beyond the disclosed documents. He had found the Merchant Tower acquisition in St. Louis. He had found the Harborview portfolio in Baltimore, the same portfolio I had been building during the months my brother cited as the reason everything started. He had found the 40-year ground lease in Phoenix. He had seen the full picture of what I had actually built, and he had called Adrian with a single question that she wanted to relay to me verbatim. She looked at me steadily and said, he asked whether his client had any idea who she was actually divorcing. Whether she understood the full scope of what she had been living inside for 11 years. Then Adrian paused and said, he was genuinely asking, party, not adversarially. Because based on his estimate, she had negotiated herself out of a settlement that could have reached $18 to $22 million had the restructuring not occurred 6 months prior. The room was completely silent. I looked out at the skyline and said nothing for a long time. The divorce finalized on a Wednesday morning. I signed the last documents in Adrienne's office at 9 o'clock and was back in my own conference room by 10:15 for an investor call about the Baltimore expansion. That transition, from the last page of an ending to the first agenda item of what came next, was not coldness. It was the purest expression of everything my mother had tried to teach me in that 2-bedroom Gary apartment, in between double shifts and unpaid bills and a husband who had driven away and never returned. She had taught me, without ever using the word, that survival is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain become your permanent address. My brother moved to Portland, Oregon 4 months after the finalization. I heard through extended family that he was working a junior property management role, not unlike where he had started before I built him into something larger. I wished him nothing theatrical. Just the quiet, honest consequences of his own choices, which is the most any of us can reasonably ask for. Maddie relocated to Austin, Texas. I wish her neither harm nor abundance. I wish her the life her decisions constructed. I returned to my mother's grave in Gary on a Sunday in June, the first genuinely warm weekend of summer. I brought tulips, not for sentiment about Maddie, but because they were always simply the right flower, and my mother had taught me to get the small things right even when the large things were falling. I stood at her grave for a long time and told her how it ended. I told her I had not lost myself. I believe she already knew. I am 41 years old. I have 31 properties across 6 states. I eat dinner alone most evenings at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park where the owner knows my order and the lighting is warm and no one requires anything from me, and I will tell you honestly, it is the most peace I have felt in a decade. 6 weeks after finalization, Adrian called with a voice I didn't recognize. Someone who had been watching from a distance. Someone who knew how far back this really went. I told her to set up the meeting. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, like and share.